Tyson James responds, unknowingly, White's exegesis has placed him in a dilemma. Look at the two sets of plans found in Psalm 33:10 through 11. In verse 10, God frustrates the plans of the people. In verse 11, the counsel of Yahweh stands forever. White admits there is parallelism in these verses, then states that God's plans are made via his libertarian free will. Yet he concludes that the plans of the peoples are not made via libertarian free will. This seems ad hoc, since the parallelism seems to be dropped when it comes to the way the human plans are made in order to avoid the conclusion that they have libertarian freedom. Now, what did I actually say? I actually said there is only one libertarian free will. There is only one with autonomy, and that's God. So the point is that there is only one free will. There can only be one autonomous will. Because to create a second autonomous will is to create another God. Because you're creating something that's no longer dependent upon God. So we all agree God can't make another God. The Trinity can't become the quadrinity. Because these are necessary statements of the existence of God, and he does not change. So to create an autonomous will is to make a new creation that it does not flow from what God has created in Scripture. There can't be anything that Jesus did not create. And so God has autonomous will. God is free. And the nature of his autonomy, and if we want to use the term libertarian free will, yes, is completely different than any human will. The pot is not like the potter, gentlemen. There is a fundamental difference between the potter and the pot. There's a fundamental difference between God's knowledge and man's knowledge, for example, which I don't believe is something that actually Dr. Craig does believe. I don't know where they stand on that, but I would assume they probably do have a univocal view of God's knowledge rather than other perspectives. But anyway, the pot is different than the potter. And that is in the context of Psalm 33. I mentioned to you, he uses the very Hebrew term that is used of forming by a potter. The beginning of the psalm begins with God's creation of all things, which includes mankind. So it is a given in the text. It's not ad hoc. If you had started at the beginning and worked your way through it, you would see it's not ad hoc. Man is made by God. He is the one who forms mankind. He spoke and it stood firm. And he is the creator of mankind. So my question to White is, how else are the plans of the people made? Either they were made freely by the people or they were made by God, parentheses, determinism, parentheses closed. If they were made by the people, then the text would support human libertarian free will. If they were made by God, then we have God frustrating his own plans, which I'm sure White himself would find theologically abhorrent. Now, how many people do you think who first read the 33rd Psalm thought of this type of objection? I would say not a single one. I really, really doubt the psalmist never sat back and went, I wonder what they're going to think about libertarian free will. No, I don't think so. How else are the plans of the people made? So, in the Molinist world, you either have autonomy or you have puppets. Either autonomy or puppets. That's it. That is all there is. All you've got is a two-dimensional, thin piece of paper of all the richness of the biblical teaching. And you're going to get tired of me saying this, but I haven't heard anybody even try to touch it yet. Not even acknowledge it. It's just sort of like, I don't even know what he's talking about. All the biblical richness of the fact that the eternal God creates time as the theater in which he reveals his attributes to his people is wiped away. It's either All those people are little autonomous gods themselves, or they are just puppets on strings. There can be nothing in between. God is not big enough. He does not have the power to create the temporal creation as the sphere of the drama of redemption. No, no, no. We can't have that. And of course, as I've said over and over again, he then enters into his own creation. The second person of the Trinity subjects himself to time. He grows. There is a time when the body that he has assumed as part of that perfect human nature is only 2 feet tall. And it takes time to become 3 feet tall, and then to become 4 feet tall. I wonder, in Joseph's house, did they have the little marks on the doorway that are in everybody's house? He subjected himself to time. That means time's real. We're not puppets. And if you guys don't stop thinking about determinism as some simplistic puppet, God just simply pulling the strings and inserting thoughts in the heart, you will never get close to providing a meaningful argument against what we believe, because you're not listening. You are not listening. If you can look at Acts 4:27-28 and look at the centrality in the drama of redemption of Pilate and Herod and the Romans and the Jews, and just go, oh, well, if that's determinism, then it was just simply they were being forced to do what they did. No, there doesn't have to be any force. God's sovereignty is so beautiful and so powerful and so righteous and so glorious that not only did Pilate do what his nature led him to do. Now, God's restraining because he's a fallen man. He fell in Adam. He has a corrupt heart. He has a heart of stone. So God will restrain that heart of stone from doing things that he doesn't want to have to accomplish. You got a problem with that? I don't. I'm awfully glad that God restrains evil. But then you get crazy Herod. I'm sorry, if anyone proves the functional idea of middle knowledge is foolishness, Herod does. You really telling me that there is a Herod floating around out there that would always do the same thing in every circumstance you put him in? Herod was a nut. He was crazier than a hoot owl. And you put Herod in the same circumstance on the same day, he's going to do 27 different things. And nobody's going to know what it is. But God is sovereign even over a crazy man like Herod. And the beauty of the fact that he has created time as the theater in which he demonstrates all these things. You guys take that and down into a flat little piece of paper. Determinism. How did they make these plans? They made those plans as creatures. And given that he's talking about, in general, the nations around Israel, they made those plans as idolaters, as fallen sons and daughters of Adam. They made those plans out of hearts of stone to aggrandize themselves, like Nebuchadnezzar. Right? Look at all that I have done. God puts him down, and when he raises him back up, what does Nebuchadnezzar do? I'm a creature. Nobody thwarts God. Right? So how'd they make these plans? Out of a sinful heart. Out of a sinful heart. Because they can do that. Does not make them autonomous. It makes them creatures. It does not make them puppets. Because God will judge them, Isaiah chapter 10, for acting on the desires of their heart. So when you take biblical evidence as your foundation, then you can answer this. No dilemma. The dilemma was created falsely by Tyson James by saying it's one of these two possibilities only two possibilities, and neither one of them are biblical possibilities. There's no such thing as a determined puppet, and there's no such thing as an autonomous pot. So the two-horned dilemma disappeared as quickly as Thanos did. Gone. Okay. Where was I? Notice also White has committed himself to the logical coherence of libertarian freedom by saying that God himself has this type of freedom. And I say that I've said that forever, and that God is absolutely free to act according to his nature, and he is autonomous in that sense, and he is not a creature. And so to parallel God and to say, if God has this, then man must too. Well, God is timeless. I am not. My being made in the image of God does not mean that I have all the attributes of God in any way, shape, or form. I am dependent upon Scripture to tell me what the parameters of what God's creative gifting to mankind is. I don't just simply look at God and then go, well, if God can do this, then man can do this. If God can do that. No. I allow Scripture to define these things. But if there is nothing in the concept that suggests it is a God-only property, like omniscience or omnipotence, but what was the context? What was the context? Yahweh spoke and it stood firm. You've never done that. Tyson James, you've never spoken and it stood firm. You cannot create ex nihilo, and neither can I. You forgot the context. This whole psalm starts, praise Yahweh, all the creation. Everyone stand in awe of him. No one is ever to be called to stand in awe of us. So yes, notice it says right there in the context, there is nothing in the concept that suggests it is a God-only property like omniscience or omnipotence, then it follows God is able to create creatures which possess libertarian freedom. Stop. We know we're not going to get any exegesis here, but we are going to get to a point where he tries. So hold on. But notice the insertion of claims that just simply have no basis from a Christian perspective. So there's nothing in the concept that suggests it's a God-only property. I say there is. God is the only autonomous will in creation because he's the only God in creation. Yep, so yeah, it's right there. Then it follows that God is able to create creatures which possess libertarian freedom. No, he creates creatures that possess creaturely freedom, but it's not the parallel of his freedom. Wrong. And if God can create such creatures, then he must know prior to the creative decree what each such creature would freely do in any freedom-permitting circumstance, also called middle knowledge. So this is the standard argument they've been using for years, that if God can create free creatures, then he would know what they would do. That does not even follow. Oh, but you're denying omniscience. No, you are inserting an unstated assertion that at least Bill Craig is honest enough to assert openly. Because if God can create free creatures, and of course, I would say that doesn't mean libertarianly free in the sense of autonomous. That means creaturely free, responsible in the creaturely realm. That's all God holds us accountable for. That's very different than God's freedom, which is absolutely divine and based upon his nature, which is unlimited, versus our nature, which is derivative. All these things are, I thought, basic, but anyway. The point here is there is an assertion being made and saying there are these subjunctive conditionals that are true that delimit, they do not come from God's will, but they delimit God's decree. That's different than saying, well, actually the best proof of middle knowledge is that God has to be capable of making libertarianly free creatures, and therefore he must know, since he's omniscient, what they would do in any given circumstance. That may impress a lot of folks until you go, why? Why? If they have libertarian freedom, then how can it be known what they would do in any given circumstance? Because if it is known, then they're not free. And if you then place them in that situation knowing what they're going to do you not share part of the responsibility of so doing? But the point is, where did that knowledge come from? Well, it's because God is omniscient. That's not an answer. God is omniscient is a statement. What we're arguing about is what is the logical, given biblical parameters, not philosophical parameters. That's where we end up on different parts here. One of us says, this is actually wide enough for me to stand on to answer these questions. I don't have to jump over here. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to let it determine what my answers are to these questions. And so when you talk about what omniscience means, I go here. It's not omniscience of stuff that God has not created. It's not omniscience of stuff that does not flow from his will. You say, well, that all comes from what's feasible for God. Again, your Legos are still being made by someone other than God. That's not an attribute of God. You still have to answer where it comes from, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many back doors you run through, and say, well, it's just a function of omniscience. It's just a function of omnipotence. That's all you've got. And once somebody turns the light on it and says, yeah, but that doesn't mean anything, that doesn't actually answer the question, does it? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Mental knowledge, an essential component of monism. If God only knows these truths after his decision to create, then he would have no way of knowing in advance what their free choices would be, which significantly weakens rather than strengthens the doctrine of divine providence. Again, utterly reject that as well. It's a regular part of Stratton's argumentation as well. Most people don't understand that. If God only knows these truths after his decision to create. Now, these are logical moments. They're not temporal moments. But what's missing here, of course, is the idea that the fabric of time, that God works all things according to his will, that he is actually involved in that. He does what he pleases. So he knows what the result of the exercise of his divine power to create all of time and the events in time is going to be. Only by introducing the idea of autonomous creatures would you get any, well, we don't know what's going to happen. Which, of course, biblically, Christianity is based upon fulfilled prophecies in the life of Jesus. We have to affirm the utter sovereignty of God in time. They say they do that by middle knowledge. I say there is no middle knowledge. God does it by his eudokia, the freedom of his will, the demonstration of his attributes to his people. That's what time is the realm in which that takes place. Glorious realm in which that takes place. The final sentence is strange. White seems to think that God's ability to incorporate the free choices of every free creature into his providential plan, in White's terms, his ability to actuate a world, is a limitation. Yes, it's a limitation. He does not get to freely choose the world. There are worlds that are not feasible to him because of the content of middle knowledge, which Dr. Stratton will say, well, the only reason that is because you can't force somebody to love somebody. But the idea being, well, God cannot force people to act. So in other words, you can't have divine determinism. Since that is making married bachelors, then God can't do that. And that's not a limitation because that's just a logical thing, see? So you take out potter and pot. You take out the difference between God and man, creature. And then you just put it on a philosophical level, and now love has to be determined, not biblically. Not the fact that the only way we can love God is if he changes our hearts. That doesn't fit into a philosophical syllogism, you know. You can't go there. So that's where you have the problem. Consider Dr. William McCrae's description of a possible world. Quote, by a possible world, one doesn't mean a planet or even a universe, but rather a complete description of reality or a way reality might be. End quote. I think exactly the opposite of White's claim is true. God's ability to incorporate free choices into his selection of a complete description of reality is an indication of his perfect power and knowledge. Which is more powerful, a being which can incorporate free choices into its exhaustive providential planning or one which cannot? Again, see how far out of Psalm 33 we've gone. See how far out of the exhaustive creation that is described in Psalm 33 we've gone. And so now the argument is, well, I think it just makes God really big that he can take this stuff that we cannot ground, we cannot explain where it comes from. And sometimes we say it's part of God's nature, and sometimes we say it's an attribute, and sometimes we say whatever. He can take all that stuff and he can bring that in. That makes him greater than a God just forces people to do stuff. Where's the problem there? Forces people to do stuff. That's just simply a straw man argument. Jesus was a true man. Was he a puppet? Was he forced to do certain things? Did God have middle knowledge of what the God-man Jesus Christ would do based upon middle knowledge? All these are big questions that betray the shallowness of the categories of the Molinistic apologist in making his argumentation.